Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Vicki Pretlow, and I am an Energy Assistance Program Specialist with the Operations Branch of the Division of Energy Assistance in the Office of Community Services. I'd like to welcome you all here today on behalf of OCS. We're very glad that you decided to join in with us, and we're excited about the information that will be shared with you today. Today's webinar will be providing a step-by-step overview of the fiscal year 2018 household report. And there are going to be two presenters that you'll be hearing from today. The first is Ms. Grace Rehaut and Mr. Dan Bausch, both from Apprise. Today's webinar has three purposes. The first is to provide you with an introduction to the annual household report, and that's the long form version of the household report. The long form is the version that the state grantees and some of the territory grantees are required to complete each year as a part of the reporting requirements for LIHEAP. The second purpose of the training today is to provide you with an in-depth overview of the household report. And you'll be reviewing each item that you'll need to report line by line and the steps to report accurately according to the instructions. And then the final purpose of the webinar today is to highlight key things to remember and to keep in mind to avoid common reporting issues. And so the audience for this webinar is broad. It is for new LIHEAP coordinators. It's for experienced LIHEAP coordinators as well. For the newer LIHEAP coordinators and staff who have not worked on the household report, I think you'll find it really helpful to you. And then for more experienced LIHEAP coordinators, this will be a good review for you. To kind of hear some more about the details in the report. So today's webinar is the second of three webinars regarding the FY18 household report. If you are already familiar with the household report and the instructions, the next webinar, which is going to be in December, will provide a brief 30-minute review of the requirements and some of the nuances. That webinar is intended for more experienced LIHEAP coordinators and staff, and it will be similar to the first one that was presented in October. You'll be receiving information regarding registration for that webinar in the coming weeks. We're really hoping that these trainings have been helpful and will continue to be helpful for you. And again, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention and your participation in today's call. And with that, I will turn it over to our colleagues at Apprise. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicki. As Vicki was mentioning, today's webinar is going to be a detailed overview of the household report. It's going to take about 90 minutes. We're going to go through each line and really comb through the reporting instructions. If you look on the sidebar for the GoToWebinar platform, there is a handout. You can download a copy of the slides and keep them or provide them to other staff who work on the household report. And the webinar is being recorded and will be put on ACF's YouTube channel. If you have a question during any part of the webinar, you can go to the question box on the GoToWebinar platform and type it in. And then during one of our question breaks, we have several of them, we're going to go through as many of the questions as we can. And during those breaks as well, if you want to, and if you're connected by a phone and have typed in the audio PIN number, you can ask a question over the phone, and we'll do our best to answer it. And as always, if you have any questions that you think of later or that don't get addressed, you can reach out to us at Apprise or reach out to your liaison, and we'll work to get your question answered. Here's a picture that shows where the question box is on the side and how to expand the sidebar by hitting that little arrow button that points to the left. And now Grace is going to go over some background and the basics of the household report.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grace Rehaut, and I'm also a member of the Apprise team. We wanted to start today by giving you a quick overview of the history of the household report and what it is used for. As you all know, probably, the household report is a required annual report that grantees are required to submit to HHS as part of their LIHEAP application for funding. Grantees have been submitting these reports since 1980, and they're used to collect and then report information essentially about how LIHEAP is working, how many people it is serving, what types of households are being served, and what kinds of outcomes LIHEAP is producing. This data goes directly into the annual LIHEAP report to Congress, which is provided to Congress each fiscal year. And it's also published in the LIHEAP data warehouse, and it's also used to respond to congressional and White House inquiries. So it's very important in helping us to reflect an image of what LIHEAP is doing and accomplishing each year. The household report involves two types of data. First, it involves data about households that received LIHEAP assistance. And second, it involves data about households that applied for LIHEAP assistance. As you also may know, there are two versions of the report. There is the long form, which is used by state grantees and certain territory grantees. And there's also the short form, which is used only by tribal grantees. Today's webinar will focus on the long form. You also might know that the form has two sort of deadlines. First, in September, we ask you to submit household reports using preliminary data, and that can be estimated. It doesn't need to be final. Then, typically in December, we ask you to resubmit your household report using final non-estimated data. Some grantees are able to submit final data by the deadline in September, and that's great. But other grantees are not able to do that, and that's also fine as long as you do go in and update your data by the final due date at the end of the year. The household report is just one of several reports that grantees are required to submit each fiscal year. Before the fiscal year even begins, we ask you to submit model plans, and those indicate the types of LIHEAP assistance that you're planning to provide during the upcoming fiscal year. Then you administer your program, the fiscal year passes, and when that's over, we ask you to submit a couple more reports about how that year went. So first, you are submitting the household report, which, as we've said, is all about reporting counts of households that either applied for or were assisted with LIHEAP assistance during the past year. Then we will also ask you to submit the performance data form, and that contains two required modules in addition to one optional module. The first required module is the grantee survey, and that's all about reporting on sources and uses of LIHEAP funds in the past fiscal year. So that is very concerned with money, how it was obtained, how it was spent. And the second required module is the performance measures, and that's all about how LIHEAP is really creating outcomes in your state in terms of energy burden targeting and in terms of maintaining or restoring home energy service across the fiscal year. Approval for the fiscal year 2018 household report form expired on October 31st, and the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, is currently working on renewing that household report for 3 more years. OMB is expecting to approve the renewal of the report in December, and after that point, HHS will publish an action transmittal with the final due date for the form, as well as instructions for completing and submitting the form in OLDC. Even though that information and action transmittal will not be published until later, we do recommend that you prepare your final data for your 2018 household report now, as we do expect the reports to be due in December. And the way we recommend you do that is by looking back to your fiscal year 2017 household report. It's important to note that there are no changes to the fiscal year 2018 household report. And the requirements are exactly the same as in last year's report, as in fiscal year 2017. So you can absolutely get started on your fiscal year 2018 report now by going back and reviewing last year's instructions for the household report. And you can also go back and review issues that we identified during review of your form last year, and you can use that to start working on your form this year. So we're now going to move over and talk about reporting rules for the household report.
So on this slide, we've listed 4 reporting rules for you to keep in mind as you're working on your 2018 household reports. The first is to report data according to the official instructions. The second is to talk about anything that's unique about your program that doesn't quite fit the household report structure in the notes section. The third is to provide a consistent report with final data. And the fourth is to investigate and address any issues or questions that come up during the review of your report in a timely fashion. Okay, so the first reporting rule, reporting according to the instructions. LIHEAP is a block grant, as you all know, and you have freedom as grantees to design your program, and grantees vary in the program features that they include and administer. But as part of OCS's requirement to report information to Congress, they need to report uniform information on households that are receiving LIHEAP assistance. So OCS issues instructions for the household report, and you should review those instructions for guidance on how to correctly report in the household report, and reach out to your liaison if you're encountering any challenges in reporting according to those instructions. Here's a good example. We're going to talk about this first example in a few slides. You may have a program that operates on a different fiscal year than the federal fiscal year. However, for the household report, you are to report households that are assisted or that apply during the federal fiscal year. The second example is that you may have a reporting system that is capturing information at the benefits level. But for the household report, you're being asked to report information on the number of households that receive assistance rather than the number of benefits issued. Second reporting rule is to explain unique features in the notes section. So the household report includes a notes section, and that is really a catch-all section where you can put any information to clarify what you put in your report, to explain why a warning that appears in OLDC may be correct or incorrect, and to explain anything that's out of the ordinary. So we encourage you to use that notes section because it helps OCS to understand your report and your program, and it's also used to help give information to Congress by putting footnotes and notes to explain your information accurately. Here's 2 examples of that. The first is that your number of households that you report as receiving heating assistance may be the same as the number that you report for any type of LIHEAP assistance, because you always provide heating assistance prior to other types of assistance. That would be a good situation where you could put a note to explain why those 2 numbers are the same. And the second example is that you might be filling out your report and validate it and get a warning message in OLDC that the number of households for cooling assistance is substantially different from the prior year. That would be a situation where you would want to investigate that difference and explain why it's there in the notes section. The third reporting rule is to provide a consistent report with final data. As Grace was saying, for your preliminary report that's due in September, you're allowed to use estimated data. But for the final report that's typically due in December, you should be reporting with final data that comes out of your data reporting system. So you should be able to identify and count households according to the instructions for each reporting item using that system. And then OCS does have validations and checks to help you with your reporting. The first series of checks occurs in the OLD system. When you validate your report, you'll see warning messages or error messages alerting you to problems or potential problems. And then once your report is submitted, Apprise reviews it and does checks against other reports and will reach out to you with any questions or concerns. So this is an example of the kinds of data that you need to be able to complete your household report and what you need to be capturing in your data reporting system. So you'll see this is household level information, and you're going to need to capture information like the number of members in the household, the annual income, the types of members in the household, and what kinds of assistance they received as part of your program. Fourth reminder on reporting rules is to investigate and address any issues. We reach out about any issues found during a review of your submitted report, and it's expected that you'll be able to respond to those questions and investigate any issues and be able to look back into your own queries or reports or documentation to understand where the information came from that you reported for a specific item. Okay, now we're going to move into the report and we're going to start going line by line. We're going to start with section 1, which is about reporting the number of assisted households. This is the total number of households that receive different types of LIHEAP assistance. So section 1 is about reporting unduplicated number of households. Again, household report is all about reporting number of households. And there are lines for each type of LIHEAP assistance, and there's also lines that cross over and ask you to report the number of households for multiple types of assistance. So we're going to go over each of these. So the first line is heating assistance, line 1, and this is how the form looks in OLDC, and you'll see this throughout the webinar. Okay, so heating assistance, what benefits are counted? When we're speaking about heating assistance, we're typically talking about a benefit that goes to a household to help pay for a share of a household's heating expenses using funds that are allocated for regular heating assistance. So for each portion of the household report, each type of assistance, what you're being asked to do is to report about types of assistance as you've classified or categorized them using the definitions of your program and that you've outlined in your state plan. For some states, heating assistance can also include expedited heating assistance. We're going to talk about that more in a few slides. And for some states, it may also include things like heating equipment repair and replacement done on a non-emergency basis. So most grantees pay for heating equipment repair and replacement through their crisis program if it's on an emergency basis, or through their weatherization program. But there are some grantees who, for example, do a furnace tune-up and they use heating assistance funds for that, and then they would report that as heating assistance. Okay, so what is the reporting period? Households that received heating assistance during the fiscal year of the report would be the correct period that you're asked to report to. So for the fiscal year 2018 household report, you're being asked to report the number of households that received heating assistance from October 1st of 2000 17 through September 30th, 2018. That means that if your program operates on a different program year, such as July 1st to June 30th, for the household report, you still need to report the number of households that were served during the federal fiscal year. And you'll need a way to identify those households separately from other reports that you might have to provide for your state or for other reporting requirements. So expedited heating is one form of assistance that certain grantees provide, so you may be familiar with it or you may not be familiar with it. Expedited heating assistance, when we're speaking about that, we're talking about if your program does not have a separate crisis component or separate crisis funds, but when somebody comes in and applies for assistance, if they're in a crisis situation, according to your definition of a crisis situation, you would provide them with a heating assistance benefit on an expedited timeline. So for the household report, what the instructions ask you to do is to report those households under both heating assistance and crisis assistance, and to also include a note that explains that you don't have a separate crisis program and that you're providing expedited heating assistance. And this goes back to your model plan. In your model plan, there is a question about how you handle crisis situations. You'll see it on the bottom of the slide. And it's expected that if you have an expedited heating assistance, you would have that fast track box checked off in your model plan. So this is an item that applies to certain grantees. And if you have any questions about this, definitely reach out to us and ask us. Okay, what if a household received multiple heating assistance benefits? Again, the household report isn't a report about the number of benefits. It's really a report about the number of households. So throughout the webinar, you'll hear this concept of an unduplicated count of households. And that just means that each household should only be counted once for a specific data element. And we're going to show you an example on the next slide. This is directly out of the instructions that are published each year for completing the household report. If you look on the left side, there are 5 households, household A, B, C, D, and E. And household A received 3 heating assistance benefits during the course of the fiscal year, 1 year-round crisis benefit. So even though household A received 3 different heating assistance benefits, they came in October, maybe they came back in January, and then again in March and got 3 different benefits. Because household A is only one household, you would only count it once when you're reporting the number of households that got heating assistance. So if you need any help with this, I'd encourage you to look at the instructions and to also reach out with any questions. As I was saying earlier, most grantees pay for heating equipment repair and replacement through their crisis program on an emergency basis or through their weatherization program. But some of you may report households that receive heating equipment repair and replacement under heating assistance if it was done on a non-emergency basis, and if you paid for it with funds that you've designated for heating assistance. So it goes back to how you have determined to set aside funds and what you've indicated in your model plan. If a household received a regular heating benefit, so money to pay a share of their heating expenses, and also received equipment repair and replacement under heating funds, then you would still want to report that household only once on this heating assistance line. And any situations like this where there's a household that received 2 different types of benefits, but there's only one line in the household report to report that type, that's a situation where we'd ask you to add a note and to to clarify the number that got a certain type of benefit versus another number that received a different type. So households can be served with funds that were obligated in the prior year. And if a household was served in the current fiscal year that the report is asking about, in this case, fiscal year 2018, but they were served with funds that were obligated earlier in fiscal year 2017, we're still asking you to report those households that received a benefit during fiscal year 2018 in this report. If you have a situation like that where a large number of households received assistance, but it was using funds from a prior fiscal year, that's also a situation where you could add a note so that when we see the amount of households served compared to the amount of funds you obligated, we're better able to understand why those numbers might not seem complementary because you're using funds that were actually issued earlier. Okay, so the household report is focused on households that were assisted with LIHEAP. So if you provided LIHEAP assistance and you also provided assistance using another program, another source of funds, the general rule is that you want to include a household in the household report if it received any LIHEAP funds. If you have another program that you administer and a household was assisted with no LIHEAP dollars, then that household should not be included in the household report. Okay, as we were saying earlier, when you submit your final report, it's expected that you'll be submitting actual data that comes out of your data reporting system. So you're allowed to submit estimated data in that preliminary report. But then for the final report, it's expected that you'll put final data in, and that throughout your report, you will uncheck boxes that are meant to indicate if your data is estimated or not. So at the top of the household report, there's a question: do the data below include estimated figures? And for the final household report, you should uncheck that box once you've finalized the information in the report. Now Grace is going to go on to line 2, cooling assistance.
So in line 2 of section 1 of your household report, you are going to be reporting on cooling assistance in your state. So what benefits should be counted here? You should be reporting any households that received a cooling assistance benefit, and that is defined as any household that receives LIHEAP assistance to pay a share of the household's cooling bills using funds allocated for regular cooling assistance. So for example, some states run summer or year-round crisis programs to address household cooling needs. That is not what is being counted here. Rather, you should only be counting cooling households that are receiving benefits categorized as cooling based on the definition in your model plan. So it really is about funding. If the funding is that is being used to assist these households comes from your cooling assistance funding, then those are cooling assistance households that should be reported here in line 2. Again, just as with heating households, cooling assistance should also include any households that received cooling equipment repair or replacement on a non-emergency basis in the fiscal year. So for example, some states provide AC units to households in need. If those units are being provided on a non-emergency basis and they otherwise fall within the boundaries of the state's cooling assistance program that's spelled out in their model plan, households assisted with those AC units should be counted here in the cooling assistance line. When filling out your reports across the year, you want to make sure that you're telling a consistent story about how your program is operating. And so that goes back to, as Dan mentioned, your model plan in this case. If your model plan has indicated that you were planning to have a cooling program in a given year, you should be reporting households assisted with cooling assistance in your household report. There are exceptions to that. So, for example, if you didn't propose a certain or definitive plan to provide cooling assistance in your model plan, it is, of course, understandable that you might not end up reporting cooling assistance households in your household report. But barring those sorts of issues, you should be planning to report cooling assisted households if you did indicate you'd be running a cooling assistance program in your model plan. If there is some sort of reason why that isn't the case, do just leave a note. And you'll see that this is going to be a theme throughout this presentation. If anything is not lining up or making sense in your household report, or if there is some sort of inconsistency between your household report and your model plan or some other sort of form, just leave a note and explain why that is the case, because otherwise you will be likely to get an email, from someone at OCS or a prize that says, you said you were going to be doing cooling this year in your model plan. Why aren't we seeing cooling assisted households in your form? So here is an example of what I'm talking about here. So this first image on your left is looking at section 1 of the model plan. If in that section you've checked that you will be having cooling assistance in your state in that fiscal year, you should then be reporting cooling assisted households in section 1 of your household report. Again, if there's some reason for that, if there's some reason why your forms aren't matching up in this way, do just leave a note, but otherwise you should be reporting cooling assisted households in your form. And finally, some of the reporting requirements and guidelines that Dan was just speaking about with reference to heating assistance also do apply to cooling assistance. So we do recommend that you go back and review those rules, including the rules about unduplicated counts, reporting households within the given fiscal year, and review those slides, keeping cooling assistance households in mind. So next, Dan will be talking about crisis assistance in section 1.
All right, now we're going to look at the different types of crisis assistance and reporting them in the household report. So crisis assistance, as most of you know, is assistance that's provided in a situation where the household is in a crisis and the assistance is provided under an expedited timeline. Grantees are free to set their own criteria for crisis assistance and define that in their model plans. And crisis reporting for the household report should be consistent with what you put in your model plan. So the household report has 5 categories of crisis assistance that can be reported. There's year-round crisis assistance, winter crisis assistance, summer crisis, emergency furnace repair and replacement, and other crisis assistance. So we're going to talk about each of them. So what if another agency administers crisis assistance and you're not tracking that in your own system? In that situation, you're going to need to obtain the household level data from your subgrantees or the program partners who are capturing this information. This also applies for weatherization assistance if you have a program partner who's administering that and capturing that information. The reason you need the household level data is you're going to have to report an unduplicated count of households that are receiving any type of LIHEAP assistance. We're going to go over that line shortly. To do that, you're going to need to match that data against your other types of LIHEAP assistance so you can make sure you're counting each household only once. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we get to that line of the household report. Okay, so year-round crisis assistance. Each grantee can vary in terms of the crisis assistance components they have. And typically, year-round crisis assistance involves crisis assistance that's provided throughout the year rather than on a seasonal basis. Examples of this could be bill payment assistance that's provided if a household is disconnected from their service or receives a disconnect notice, or they receive an emergency fuel delivery after running out of fuel or being low on fuel. Winter crisis assistance, again, it's any household that receives winter crisis according to the criteria that you've defined in your model plan. But typically, winter crisis assistance is bill payment assistance, so a payment that helps pay a share of energy expenses that goes to a household that has been disconnected during the winter heating season. Another example is receiving fuel during the winter. Summer crisis assistance, that typically is assistance that's provided under the same timeline as your state's cooling assistance program, and that is normally bill payment assistance that goes to a household during the summer cooling season after that household has entered a crisis situation. So as you can probably tell from what I'm saying, each state has flexibility in how they determine this, but for the household report, you're expected to report consistently with what you've identified in your model plan as the types of crisis assistance you provide. So those first three, the year-round winter crisis assistance and summer crisis assistance, are really focused on bill payment assistance for households that are experiencing a home energy crisis. The next type of crisis that you see on this slide is focused on equipment repair and replacement. So this would be any household that receives equipment repair replacement in an emergency situation using your crisis assistance funds. That's generally repairing an inoperable furnace or an inoperable system within that 48-hour time period. And there is a field in your model plan that asks you if you provide equipment repair and replacement using crisis funds. And it's expected that if you have that checked, yes, you'll report households, and vice versa. If there's households you report in your household report for emergency furnace repair and replacement, you'll have that checked in your model plan. So the household report includes a other crisis assistance category, and this category allows you to report about any other crisis assistance that doesn't fit into your definition of year-round crisis assistance, winter, summer, or emergency furnace and repair. And in general, other crisis assistance is not going to include bill payment assistance or emergency equipment and repair. It may be things like providing blankets, providing space heaters using LIHEAP funds. Some states do rental assistance if there's a medical emergency. There's a lot of variations in how people offer crisis assistance, and that's what these other crisis assistance lines are there for you to do, to be able to report about those types of assistance. So other crisis assistance gets reported on line 3E and 3F in section 1. And there's the ability to enter information about what those programs are and what the assistance is there and in the notes section. Okay, so how should other crisis assistance be reported? The information on this slide comes right out of the instructions that are available and published with the action transmittals for completing the household report. And the instructions ask you to report those households on lines 3E and 3F, but also if a household received other crisis assistance and they didn't receive the main types of crisis assistance you offer year-round or winter or summer, that you should add those households in and include a note that says how many households received other crisis assistance. This is a reporting requirement to be able to give information on the total number of households that are getting each type of crisis assistance. And if there's any questions you have about doing this, or this sounds different from what you've been doing or done in the past, we would ask that you reach out to us, and we'll work to help you verify that. So with crisis assistance, there's several things that I talked about with heating assistance that also apply to how you are supposed to report crisis assistance. And this slide tells you which slides to go back and look at to go over each of those topics. Okay, now Grace is going to go over weatherization assistance.
So weatherization assistance will be reported in line 4 of section 1, and that comes right after the crisis assistance lines that Dan was just speaking about. So which households should be reported as receiving weatherization assistance? Here, you can just refer to the definition of weatherization assisted households. That is any household that received low-cost residential weatherization and other energy-related home repair using LIHEAP funds. As many of you know, LIHEAP weatherization can be administered under a variety of rules and guidance. That can be entirely LIHEAP rules, entirely DOE WAP rules, or even a mix of the two. It does depend on the state, but the setup for that should be outlined in your state plan. Also, grantees can only use 15% of their LIHEAP funds for weatherization assistance. So HHS can provide a waiver to increase that percentage to 25%, but otherwise only 15% of LIHEAP funds should be used for this program component. So just as Dan was speaking about with regards to crisis assistance, many of you will have another organization like a sub-grantee or program partner that's actually responsible for administering weatherization assistance in your state. If that is the case, you do want to be careful when preparing data for your household report, because you're going to need to make sure that you collect household level data from these other organizations, and not just obtain raw counts of weatherization assisted households. The reason for that is that you'll be using weatherization data not just to report the raw count of weatherization assisted households in your form, but also to report the number of households that received any type of LIHEAP assistance in line 5 of section 1. So just to give an example of that, say the Smith household received both heating assistance and weatherization assistance in fiscal year 2018. Because any type of LIHEAP assistance is an unduplicated count, you'd only want to count that household that received 2 types of benefits once. But if you just get a raw count of weatherization assisted households from your sub-grantee or program partner, you won't be able to know that the Smiths received both heating and weatherization assistance. And as a result, you'll probably end up double counting the Smith household in your any type of assistance line. For that reason, it's really important that you do get household level data on weatherization assistance so that you're able to have complete data about all the different types of assistance that households in your state received. In order to do that and connect data from your subgrantee or program partner with your own program data, you can develop a unique household ID for each LIHEAP recipient in your state. And then you can use that ID to match weatherization data to other program data. If you need any help with that, please feel free to contact us at Apprise, and we can help you to figure that out. Once again, as we talked about with heating, cooling, and crisis, if your model plan says that you have a weatherization program or that you're putting money towards weatherization in a given fiscal year, you should be reporting households under weatherization assistance. If you know that you said that you would be doing weatherization in your model plan and for some reason don't have households to report in your household report, do just, again, leave a note and explain why no households were served with weatherization assistance in that year, whether that's because of funding limitations or any sort of reason that there could be. Here again is just a visual representation of that. So again, if we see weatherization checked in section 1 of your model plan, there is an expectation that you should be counting households under weatherization assistance in your household report. If you are providing equipment repair and replacement using weatherization funds, you should be reporting those households under weatherization assistance. Again, this is only if weatherization funds were used. So if you provided equipment repair and replacement using crisis funds, you should be reporting those households under emergency equipment repair and replacement in line 3D. And in turn, if you, for example, provided equipment repair or replacement using heating or cooling funds, like the idea we discussed earlier of providing AC units on a non-emergency basis, that should be reported either under heating or cooling. So again, if you're using weatherization funds to provide equipment repair and replacement, that is the only type of equipment repair and replacement household that should be counted under weatherization assistance. And again, some other rules that we've discussed previously, such as the rules about unduplicated counts or households served with prior year funds, do apply again to weatherization assistance. So please refer back to the listed slides here to review information on those topics. And next, Dan is going to present about the any type of LIHEAP assistance line, which is line 5 of section 1.
Okay, if you could go to the next slide, Grace. So the any type of LIHEAP assistance field is intended to capture the total number of households that received any kind of LIHEAP benefit you provided during fiscal year 2018. So you're supposed to count the each household only once, even if they received multiple different types of assistance. So on the next slide, we're going to show an example. Here's that same visual that I showed earlier for heating assistance. And again, on the left side, you have household A through household E, 5 households. So since there's 5 households, they each got different combinations of LIHEAP benefits from your program. But under the any type of LIHEAP assistance, the count is going to be 5 because there's 5 households. So the general guidelines with correctly reporting for this field are to confirm that you don't have any duplicate clients, that you're only counting each household once. And there's 2 checks you can do to see if the information you're you're getting from your query or getting from whoever does the report is correct. The first is that the any type of LIHEAP assistance count should be greater than the number of households reported in an individual type of assistance field. So, for example, if you provide heating assistance and crisis assistance and weatherization assistance, the any type of LIHEAP assistance field should generally have a higher number than any one of those three assistance fields by itself. The exception to this would be if a household has to receive heating assistance before they receive any other type of assistance. Then the any type of LIHEAP assistance count would match the heating assistance count. And then the second rule you can look at is that the number of households you report for any type of LIHEAP assistance should be less than if you added up all the values you put in the other fields in your household report for each individual assistance type. So these are two checks that you can do, and we would recommend you give to your IT staff just to verify that any type of LIHEAP assistance is calculated correctly. A similar concept to the any type of LIHEAP assistance field is line 6, the bill payment assistance field. So bill payment assistance is a term that you hear about for the household report and for Module 2 of the performance data form. Bill payment assistance is defined as a household that's provided with a LIHEAP benefit used to pay a share of the household's energy bills. This translates to any kind of a regular LIHEAP benefit or a benefit, a crisis benefit that goes to help pay for energy bill or fuel, and it would exclude things like weatherization or equipment repair and replacement. So if a household received a heating benefit, a regular cooling benefit, crisis assistance benefit, it would be counted. If a household only received weatherization or only received equipment repair and replacement, then it wouldn't be counted in bill payment assistance. Just as with the any type of LIHEAP assistance line, the bill payment assistance line is intended to be a unduplicated count of households. In this case, that received bill payment assistance. Next slide, Grace. Again, if you provide weatherization or equipment repair and replacement, then bill payment assistance will be less than your any type of LIHEAP assistance count, because the any type of LIHEAP assistance count will include households that received other types of assistance besides bill payment assistance. This is a way to explain the connections between two of the reports you do, the household report and the performance data form. The household report for bill payment assistance, you count up all those households and report them in line 6. And then when you go to complete your performance data form in Module 2, the energy burden targeting section, Section 5, the first line you're asked to report about is the number of LIHEAP bill payment assisted households, and then to break apart that number by main heating fuel. So those two numbers should match. So when you go back to do your performance data form, after completing your household report, you should be able to identify the same number of households and then report on them by main heating type. The last line in Section 1 is nominal payments. Nominal payments are payments that grantees make as part of a partnership with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. Only a few states are doing this. There are also this is often referred to as HEAT heat or eat or cool or eat program, and any households that you're providing a nominal payment to for this purpose should be reported on that nominal payment line and should not be reported in any of the other lines. So even in any type of LIHEAP assistance line or the bill payment assistance line, we're asking that you do not report households that just receive the nominal payment in partnership with SNAP on those lines, but only report them on the nominal payments line. And as we've hit home a few times, if you are providing nominal benefits, then that should be indicated in your model plan. Okay, here's an example. You would report households that received a nominal payment in line 7, and then in the notes section you should explain. In this case, this is a made-up example. New York State issued a $21 nominal heat and eat benefit to one household. So this is a summary slide about unduplicated counts, and here's a couple examples that might be helpful to provide to staff that assist with the household report. So for each different line, you're doing an unduplicated count. What if a household received multiple benefits for the same type of assistance? That household should only be counted once when reporting the count of households that receive that type of assistance. What if a household received more than one type of assistance? Then that household would be included in the count for each type of assistance. So if a household received heating assistance and a household received weatherization assistance, it gets counted in the heating assistance line and in the weatherization assistance line. And then finally, when you're calculating the any type of assistance line or the bill payment assistance line, each household only gets counted once. So this is just kind of a handy reminder slide you can pin up for your staff to remind you of what gets reported under each of these scenarios. Okay, now we're going to open it up for any questions. Again, if you have questions, just submit them through the question box, or you can raise your hand and Grace will call on you. Are there any questions over the phone, Grace?
No, I don't see any yet.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll just, let's see. Okay, looks like we did have some. Okay, we had...
2 questions were submitted in the questions box.
Yep. Should year-round crisis assistance be included in heating and cooling? The answer is no. Crisis assistance should be only reported in one of those crisis assistance lines, depending on how you've defined it in your model plan. Same thing with emergency furnace and replacement would be reported under crisis assistance in the emergency furnace repair and replacement line. What if a household receives heating assistance for the heating fuel and crisis assistance for their electricity? Should this be reported on 2 lines? The answer is yes. So if a household received a regular heating assistance benefit and then later on receives a crisis assistance benefit, you'd be reporting that household in both the heating assistance line and the crisis assistance line. Okay. All right. To make sure we keep moving with time, we'll move on and we'll have a couple more question periods. Now we're going to move on to section 2, which is the number of assisted households by poverty interval.
So here is a graphic of what section 2 will look like. You'll notice that just as in section 1, we're going to be asking you to report on households assisted with heating, cooling, crisis, and weatherization assistance. So in Section 2, we are asking you to essentially take the numbers that you reported in Section 1 and break them down by poverty level. So just as in Section 1, you should again be reporting unduplicated counts of assisted households by poverty interval for heating, cooling, crisis, and weatherization assistance. And as a result of that, we expect that for each type of assistance, the sum of the number of households you report in each poverty interval will add up to the total number of households you reported in Section 1. And that's an important concept, so we'll give you an example on the next slide. Also important to note, you should make sure that your reporting in Section 2 is consistent with the income thresholds that you defined in your state plan. That might seem obvious, but states can and do change their poverty intervals. So you just want to make sure that you are reporting here in a consistent way with the thresholds that you defined before the fiscal year even started in your model plan for that year. So here is that concept of items matching between Section 1 and Section 2 of your form. Say in Section 1 that you've reported assisting 13 households with heating assistance in the past fiscal year. In Section 2, then, the number of households that you report across all the poverty intervals should add up to exactly 13. And we see that in this example here. This state is reporting that of those 13 heating-assisted households, 2 were in the first poverty interval, 3 in the second, 5 in the third, and so on. And again, across those poverty intervals, 2 plus 3 plus 5 plus 1 plus 2 will add up to 13. So one thing you can do to help make sure those numbers line up is to be very clear and consistent about each household's income and how you report it. And that's an important concept that we're going to talk about next.
So part of what we talked about in the beginning of the webinar was the need to have consistent reporting so OCS can provide information to Congress and stakeholders that's uniform. So when determining your state's eligibility for LIHEAP for fiscal year 2018, there were a few options that grantees could choose from. They could use the HHS poverty guidelines that were in effect at the beginning of the fiscal year. Those were the 2017 poverty guidelines. You could use the state median income. If a component began later in the year, you could use the 2018 poverty guidelines that were released after fiscal year 2018 started. And grantees can also switch mid-year to those new guidelines as well. So since grantees can use different income guidelines, how should you report households in Section 2? The instructions ask that you report households according to the income standard that was used at the beginning of the fiscal year, which is the 2017 poverty guidelines. There's a link in the slides if you download them to those guidelines. And grantees that used other income guidelines that were in effect later, like the 2018 guidelines, are still asked to report households according to the 2017 guidelines for Section 2 of the household report. So here are the steps to assign each household to a poverty interval. There's 4 basic steps. The first is that when a household applies, you need to collect their income, their household income, and the number of members in that household. The second step is that if the income amount your state collects on your application or during your intake process is for a period less than a year, you might collect the last 3 months, for example, you need to convert that to be annual income. The third step is that you divide the household's annual income amount by the 2017 HHS poverty guidelines for your state and for that household size. So again, those are available at that link provided on the last slide. Once you've done that division, you then multiply it by 100, and that tells you the percent of poverty that that household has, so you can classify them into one of those poverty intervals. The next slide, this slide has an example of what this might look like. So a household has a gross annual income of $26,549. They have 3 household members. According to the 2017 poverty guidelines, for Arizona, 20,420 represents 100% of the poverty guidelines. So you divide this household income of $26,539 by the guideline amount. And then you multiply the result, and that tells you the state's, or that tells you the household's poverty level, so you can classify them. And in this case, this household has a value of about 130%. That would fall into that 126% to 150% category in the household report. In general, you should have the income information for the households that you're providing assistance to. But if there's a circumstance where it's missing, there's guidance on this slide for how to address that. We ask that you report those in the highest bin, and then add a note explaining that there were households missing income information. For now, we're going to move past this question period to make sure we get through everything, and we'll address questions after we get through a little bit more of the webinar. Okay, now we're going to look at section 3, which is the number of assisted households by vulnerable population.
So here is section 3. As Dan said, it is reporting on assisted households by vulnerable population. So this section is important because it traces back to the roots of LIHEAP, which has a goal of providing vulnerable populations with energy assistance. And 3 specific types of vulnerable groups are identified in the LIHEAP statute: households with 1 or more elderly members, households with 1 or more disabled members, and households with 1 or more young children. The LIHEAP statute does set out specific definitions for households with elderly members and young children. So elderly is defined as a person 60 years or older. So any household with someone 60 years or older would be counted as a vulnerable household. And in turn, a young child is defined as someone under 5 years of age. So again, any household with a child under 5 should be considered vulnerable. The definition of disabled household members is not laid out in the LIHEAP statute. So as a result, it is up to each state to decide their own definition for this category. And that should be laid out in the model plan. For example, some states define households that receive that have members receiving disability insurance as disabled vulnerable households. So that is just one example of a way to categorize that. In order to report data about households with vulnerable members, you can collect data about these vulnerable populations as part of the LIHEAP application or intake process. Then you should store that data in your data management system and create an indicator field for each type of vulnerability. So for example, you would have some sort of indicator as to whether each household contains a disabled member, an elderly member, or a young child. Then, using those three indicators that you've created, you should also make a fourth indicator to indicate whether or not a household has any type of vulnerable member. And that's going to be helpful in reporting for Section 3 specifically. So if a household has either a disabled member, an elderly member, or a young child, there should be a place to mark that down as just one check for each household.
So just as in the other prior sections of the report, Section 3, you're still reporting on households, and you're still reporting unduplicated counts by each data element. So grantees should report the number of assisted households by vulnerable population for each type of assistance that you reported in Section 1. And in general, the households that you report in Section 3 are going to be a subset of the households reported in Section 1. Okay, so all the way on the right there, you have the elderly, disabled, or young child column, where you're reporting the number of households that have any one of those three vulnerable population types. So for this column, you're focused on a household that has at least one vulnerable member and including that there. So that means that you can't add up the amounts that are in the elderly column, the disabled column, and the young child column, since a household could have an elderly member and a young child member within it. So here's an example to help us think about this. If you look on the bottom of the slide, there are 4 households. One has an elderly member and a disabled member. One has a disabled member and a young child. One has only an elderly member. One has only a disabled member. So when you're looking at each of the 3 vulnerability types individually, for example, you're looking at column A, the 60 years and older elderly category, you want to include the count of households that has at least one elderly member. So in this case, there are 2 households. Same thing for column B, disabled, and the same thing for column C, young child. But when you get to column 4, you're counting a household that has at least one member with a vulnerability type. So in this instance, it's 4 households. So you can see if you added up A, B, and C, you would get 6. But really, there's only 4 households. So you need to be able to count those households independently of adding up the different columns in the report. Any type of LIHEAP assistance, we're going to look at that. Just as in Section 1, the any type of LIHEAP assistance field is looking across all of the different types of assistance you provide and reporting an unduplicated count of households that received any type of assistance and that fit one of those vulnerability categories. So those same guidelines that we talked about earlier apply here. And the number you report here should, in general, be less than the number in Section 1 you reported for any type of LIHEAP assistance, since you can have some households that don't have any household members with a vulnerability. Okay. I'm going to open it up quickly for any other questions. It looks like there was a clarification about the question earlier about reporting a household that got assistance for heating fuel and then got crisis assistance for electricity. When you're reporting in that bill payment assistance line or that any type of LIHEAP assistance line, you would report a household only once. Even if they got regular assistance and crisis assistance, you're still counting them only once. For the poverty guidelines, there's a question about those guidelines. I'll follow up with you on that question and send you more information offline. Okay, I think we'll move on for now and make sure we get through everything. So now we're going to look at section 4, number of applicant households, and we're going to start speeding up a little bit and get through to some of the resources that can help you with your report.
So here is section 4 of the household report. Section 4, as well as section 5 of the report, is going to deal with applicant households. So these are no longer households that necessarily received LIHEAP assistance, but rather they're households that took that first step of applying. In contrast to other sections of the form, the LIHEAP statute doesn't specify a definition of applicant households, so it is up to each state to define. For example, some states define applicant households as those that submitted an application for assistance during the fiscal year. Other states define applicants as households that visited any agency to apply. It doesn't matter how your state defines applicant households, as long as you are reporting applicant households in sections 4 and 5 of your report according to those definitions you've laid out in your model plan. As in other sections of your report, you should again be reporting households that applied for LIHEAP during the appropriate fiscal year. And so for the fiscal year 2018 household report, you should only be reporting households that applied from October 1st, 2017 to September 30th, 2018. And again, if your state does operate your LIHEAP program on a different on a different program year, just make sure that you are pulling the right data to fill out this part of the form.
So for the applicant sections of the household report, you're being asked to report the unduplicated count of households that applied for each type of LIHEAP assistance. And that's regardless of if they received the assistance. They may have applied towards the end of fiscal year 2018 and not received assistance until fiscal year 2019. All that these sections are asking you to report is the number that apply from that October 1st, 2017 to September 30th, 2018 period. So one thing you can do as you're completing your report is to compare the numbers in different sections. So in general, when you look at the number of applicant households for a type of assistance, it should be greater than or equal to the number you report as being assisted with that type of assistance. And if there's a circumstance in which that's not the case, you can add a note to explain that. So should households that received assistance in federal fiscal year 2018 but applied in the prior federal fiscal year be included in section 4? No, only households that actually applied during fiscal year 2018 are included in section 4. So again, the interest is in the number of households that applied during that specific federal fiscal year period. If a household applied in the previous federal fiscal year, the number of applicant households could differ from the number of assisted households in a specific way if there was a large change. Next slide, Grace. All right. In the interest of time, we're going to jump over this question period and we'll have more time for questions at the end. Now we're going to look at the other applicant section, section 5, which is the number of applicant households by poverty interval.
So here is what section 5 looks like. As in other parts of the form, you should again be reporting unduplicated counts of applicant households in section 5. And again, just as in Section 2, your numbers of households in each poverty interval should add up exactly to the total number of applicant households that you reported in Section 4 of your form. So just again, as just similar to the relationship between Sections 1 and 2 of the form, if you're reporting that 21 households, for example, were applied for heating assistance in Section 4 of your form, then in Section 5, you should be reporting 21 households across those poverty intervals. So when you add up the number of households within each poverty interval by program component, they should add up to the same number that you specified in Section 4.
Okay, so which income guidelines are used for reporting? Just as earlier when you're reporting assisted households by poverty interval, for Section 5, you want to report households according to that income standard that's used in the beginning of the fiscal year, which are the 2017 HHS poverty guidelines. Some grantees may not collect income information initially from all applicants. So if you're missing the income information, there is a column in Section 5, column F, for income data unavailable, and that's where you would report those households. Just as with Section 4, you can compare the number of applicant households by poverty level to the number of assisted households by poverty level. And you would expect that applicant households in Section 5 for specific poverty interval would be at least equal to or greater than the number of assisted households that you report in Section 2. All right, we're just going to keep moving here, and we'll save all the questions for the end. So the last section on the household report is Section 6, the number of assisted households by young child age category. And this section is optional.
So as Dan mentioned, Section 6 is optional, meaning that if you don't report data in this field, your form will still be considered complete and can still be accepted. That being said, this data can be useful since it can allow you to get a better sense of how your program is serving vulnerable populations in your state. So specifically in Section 6, you should be reporting or can be reporting on two different items. The number of assisted households by program component who had at least one child 2 years or under, and the number of assisted households by program component who had at least one child between 3 years old and 5 years old. So this section is essentially asking you to take the numbers of children under 5 that you reported in Section 3 and asking you to break those children out by whether they are under 2 years old or whether they're between 3 and 5 years old.
So how are the assisted households by young child category reported? You can look back to Section 3 to count the number of the guidelines for counting the number of households with at least one child who's 5 years or under. Except you then want to count the number that are 2 years or under or 3 to 5. Next slide, Grace. Again, you can compare your information that you put in this optional section to Section 3 to be able to see if there's any issues or errors in the numbers that you're reporting. Here is another example. On the bottom, there are 4 different households. They each have at least one young child. But you can see that in column A, the 2 years or younger, there's 3 households. Column B, 3 to 5 years, there's 3 households. So if you added those up, you'd get 6. But there's only 4 households, so you need to count the households in column C, count them up instead of adding the 2 columns together in your report. All right, we're going to skip this one more time and just go through the final reminders and resources and then turn to questions. So some final reminders.
So as we mentioned before, the household report is still awaiting approval from OMB, but once approval is secured, HHS will publish an action transmittal with the final due date and instructions for completing the reform. But again, as we mentioned previously, grantees are encouraged to prepare their final data for the reports in anticipation of the due date in December. And that can be done by looking back at the instructions for last year's report, which are the same as those for this year's household report. We are expecting the household report to be due in OLDC in December. So that will require final data and for all forms in the report to be completed. As a reminder, in order for your household report to be considered complete, it must be entered in OLDC, saved, certified, and then submitted. If your form is saved or validated, we won't be able, and OCS won't be able to know whether it has been completed or submitted on time. So it has to be submitted completely in OLDC for it to be considered submitted and complete. Dan referenced earlier that there are some validation checks in OLDC to help you in submitting your report. Warning messages basically will signal to you that though your data is technically correct, there might be something strange about it. And in this case, you should review the relevant section of your form, check whether the data is accurate, and think about adding a note to the notes section of your form in order to clarify why the data might seem strange or inconsistent. The second kind of validation check in OLDC is a fatal error. And you'll see this if your data have some sort of serious issue, such as being inconsistent or incomplete. And in this case, you're going to need to go back into your form and correct the data before you are able to submit the report in OLDC. As I said, if you get a warning and are able to explain why that issue is arising, do leave a note to clarify what is going on. But if you do get a warning or a fatal error that you don't know how to resolve, please feel free to contact us at Apprise, and we should be able to walk you through how to resolve the issue.
So we know this is a lot of information, and we're going to point you to some resources to help you. This is just a reminder here that after you submit your report, there's a review process where we'll contact you about any questions or possible corrections, and then you're expected to respond and look into those before your report is finalized. Next slide. Okay, here are some important links for you. The 2017 poverty guidelines that you should use for the poverty intervals are the first link. Then there are the instructions for last year's household report that you can reference, and that a lot of the guidance in this webinar is directly from. And then you can look at your state's past data in the data warehouse link on the bottom. We have a really great resource called the Check Before You Submit document that's linked here. It's a checklist, and it gives you a way to check your data and see if there's any potential issues before you submit it. So we strongly recommend that you look at this document and use it to check your report. These are OLDC resources. If you need any help accessing OLDC, you can contact the help desk here or reach out to your liaison. And these are some support resources, the liaisons, and all of us at Apprise who you can reach out to for assistance. Okay, so I know there were a few follow-up questions. One question was asked about age. The age, where does the age come from? Generally, grantees collect information about vulnerability status, if there's a young child in the household or an elderly member, at the time of application, but we can send you information from the instructions about that. Grace, are there any questions over the phone?
There is a question about reporting bill payment assistance.
Okay. Why don't you open up the line?
Okay. I'm actually seeing that the person with that question is no longer raising their hand, but I do see one other hand raised.
Okay.
Jessica Dale, you have been unmuted.
Hi, Jessica. Oh, we can't hear you, Jessica, if you're speaking. Okay, well, we can follow up with Jessica. One thing with the GoToWebinar is you need to have your audio pin entered for that to work correctly. So sometimes there's problems with that.
Okay, and we have one other hand raised.
Okay.
Jeremy Gunter, you have been unmuted.
Okay, so the question I have is about bill payment assistance. If there's a disagreement between the crisis assistance that somebody received and the heating assistance, so say, for example, heating assistance was provided for natural gas and they received crisis assistance, you indicated that the client would only be reported, or the household would only be reported once. Which would you report, the heating assistance or the electricity assistance that they received under crisis under the bill payment assistance line?
So for the household report, it's really concerned with just what types of assistance they received, not necessarily where the benefit went. So in that case, if a household got a heating assistance benefit, you're going to count them in that heating assistance line. If that same household got a crisis benefit, you're going to count them in the crisis assistance line as well. And then when you get down to the bill payment assistance line or the any type of LIHEAP assistance line, you're going to count that household once in that line. So that's an example where you'll actually report that household in multiple spots because they got different types of assistance.
Sure, but does the bill payment assistance line ask about the fuel that was assisted with?
No, it does not. For the household report, it doesn't. For the performance data form, you do have to report what that household's main heating type is.
Got it.
So in that case, it would be gas. But yes, that's a great question. Well, we know we threw a lot at you, so if you have any other questions that come up, please email Grace or I or anybody else you see listed in the slides, and we are happy to answer any additional questions. Thank you so much for your time today. And again, we'll be having a reminder webinar for people who want some final reminders or experienced LIHEAP directors, and that'll be on December 3rd. So there'll be emails about that coming soon. So thank you very much for your time, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.